Welcome. Today, we're going to dive into a really powerful mental model. It's something that some of the most innovative people on the planet use to solve incredibly complex problems. It's called first principles thinking, and it's all about completely rethinking what's even possible. But to really get why it's so powerful, we first have to talk about how most of us are taught not to think.
So let's start with a pretty provocative question from our source material. Why do most engineers fail? Now, it's not about a lack of skill or being smart enough. Nope. More often than not, it's about the way they, and let's be honest, all of us, are trained to approach problems in the first place.
Okay, so let's get into our first section, the common thinking mistake. To really appreciate a new way of thinking, we have to first be honest about our brain's default setting, that mental shortcut that we all love to take.
And that default setting? It's called reasoning by analogy. Basically, it's looking at how other people have solved a similar problem and then just copying or slightly improving their solution. It feels safe, right? It feels efficient. But it's a trap. It keeps us locked into making just slightly better versions of what's already out there, and it almost never lets us create something truly new.
So what's the alternative? Well, that brings us right to Section 2, First Principles Thinking, or Denken von Grund auf, which means thinking from the ground up. This is the tool for breaking out of that analogy trap and building something that could actually be revolutionary.
So what does that actually mean? Well, it means you ignore all the assumptions, all the conventions. You have to think like a physicist, because physics doesn't care about tradition. It only cares about what's fundamentally true. You break a problem down piece by piece into its most basic, irreducible parts. And only then, once you're at that solid foundation of fact, do you start building your solution back up.
And just look at this side by side. The difference is so clear, isn't it? On the left, with analogy, you're imitating. You're just improving what's there. You're staying on that well-worn path. But on the right, with first principles, you're deconstructing, you're boiling things down to their basic truths, and from there, you create something brand new. It's the difference between polishing a candle and inventing the light bulb.
Okay, I know this all might sound a little abstract. So for our third section, let's make it super concrete with a really powerful, real-world example, the rocket example. This is where you see just how undeniable the power of this mental model really is.
All right, imagine you want to build a rocket. The first question that probably pops into your head is, how much does a rocket cost? Seems like a pretty logical place to start, right?
Now, if you're thinking by analogy, your process is really simple. You'd go look up the price of rockets from NASA or other big space agencies, and you'd conclude, a rocket costs hundreds of millions of dollars. That's just a fact. End of story. And for most people, that's where the dream dies.
But a first principles thinker asks a totally different question. They completely ignore that historical price tag. Instead, they ask, what is a rocket actually made of? You see that? This tiny shift from focusing on price to focusing on composition changes absolutely everything.
And when you do that, what you get is basically a shopping list. You break the rocket down to its fundamental components. You got some aluminum alloys, some titanium, copper, carbon fiber, and so on. You're no longer looking at a rocket. You're just looking at a pile of raw materials.
And here it is. This is the breakthrough moment. When you actually go and price out these raw materials on the commodity markets, you discover something absolutely astonishing. The cost of the stuff that makes up a rocket is only about 2% of the typical price. Just 2%. That means the other 98% isn't some fundamental law of the universe. It's just the price of tradition. It's the cost of doing things the way they've always been done. And suddenly, the impossible starts to look very, very possible. That rocket example really gets to the core philosophy behind this entire way of thinking. And that brings us to our final section. Physics is the law. This simple, powerful idea is the key to figuring out what you can actually change and what you can't.
This quote just nails it. The laws of physics, like gravity or the chemical properties of aluminum, those are fundamental truths. They're non-negotiable. But pretty much everything else, the way we structure companies, the price we put on a product, the manufacturing process, those are just recommendations. They're just human conventions created by other people, and they can absolutely be questioned, changed, or thrown out completely.
So I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. Take a look at your own work, your industry, maybe even a personal challenge you're facing. Which recommendations, those long-held assumptions and conventions, have you been treating like they're unbreakable laws of physics? Because identifying those, that is the first step to thinking from first principles and maybe unlocking a whole new reality for yourself.